On October 1st, 1910, Americans were shocked by an act of extraordinary violence that occurred in the heart of one of the nation's largest cities. Terrorists had used dynamite to blow up the iconic building that housed the newspaper, the Los Angeles Times. It was called the crime of the century. It would lead to a massive manhunt and a case that would finally be broken by a man that's been described as America's Sherlock Holmes. A trial of the century that would nearly destroy the reputation of one of the nation's most famous attorneys in the uncovering of a conspiracy of almost unimaginable scope. The 1910 bombing of the Los Angeles Times building is proof that political violence is not new to the United States.
The life of a newspaper, like that of an individual, the LA Times wrote on July 1st, 1887, is not of a day. The building of character is the work of time. The elements of every solid and enduring reputation are welded together little by little after having been tried and tested in the furnace of experience. The paper was writing about its own history, having begun as the Weekly Mirror in February of 1873. The first printing of the LA Daily Times was on December 4th, 1881, at a time when the Times wrote, "A quiet, slow-moving, halfway frontier town was Los Angeles." The occasion that served as an excuse for the paper to write about itself in 1887 was the opening of a new, large brick building with a granite facade on Broadway and First Street. The paper wrote that the Times building is one of marked character. There is no other structure in the city, and probably none on the Pacific coast, which it resembles. The building had, they wrote, a frontage of 80 feet 9 inches and a depth of 102 feet, the side extending along Fort Street. It has a high basement, surmounted by 3 stories and attic rooms over the front portion, the paper wrote. The building, however, was also described as imposing, and perhaps that was by intent, as the military-minded general manager of the paper, Harrison Otis, referred to the building as the Fortress. On December 5th, 1891, as the paper celebrated the first decade of printing as the Times, a 7.5-foot wingspan, 200-pound bronze eagle, sculpted by celebrated artist Gutzen Borglum, later famous as the sculptor of Mount Rushmore, was added to the building. The Times wrote that the eagle was intended to represent the motto that Otis had given to the paper: "Stand fast, stand firm, stand sure, stand true." Trained in printing, Otis had been a delegate to the 1860 Republican National Convention that had nominated Abraham Lincoln. At the outbreak of the Civil War, he enlisted in the 12th Ohio Infantry. Enlisting as a sergeant, he was twice wounded in battle and promoted 7 times over the course of the war, mustering out as a lieutenant colonel in 1865. He would briefly return to service in 1898 in the Philippines and become a brigadier general, forever after going by the title General. After some years in government service, he eventually moved west and in 1882 became editor of the Los Angeles Daily Times and the Weekly Mirror. In 1886, the company reorganized as Times Mirror, and Otis was made president and general manager. The Times wrote in 2018, Otis quickly paid $5,000 for a quarter share, took Daily off the name, and in 1884 bought out a partner and incorporated the company as Times Mirror. As editor, he was an advocate for the growth of the city. The Times writes for over a century, starting in 1882, Harrison Gray Otis and his heirs, the Chandlers, used the power of the newspaper to shape Los Angeles to their interests, and were pivotal in nearly every aspect of the city's growth. Among his causes was opposition to labor. The Times writes, the Los Angeles Times rose to prominence under the leadership of a bellicose, union-busting Civil War colonel who kept an arsenal of shotguns in the newsroom in case of labor strife and drove through the city with a custom horn that looked like a cannon mounted on his hood. His fiercest battles in Los Angeles were against organized labor. In 1890, when a real estate bubble burst after a land boom and the Times needed to trim expenses, Otis proposed wage cuts for unionized typographical workers. After the workers said that they would strike, he let them go, only to bring in a union-busting group called the Printers' Protective Fraternity from Kansas City. This garnered him attention from the International Association of Bridge and Structural Iron Workers, or the IW. The Times writes, he led the charge to keep labor organizers out of Los Angeles, a relentless fight that made the city one of the most anti-labor in the nation, and a relatively small, remote newspaper became a villain to the national labor movement. Labor unrest in the early part of the century was serious business. Anti-union groups such as the Merchants and Manufacturers Association, of which Otis had control, supported open shops, and business owners used labor spies, strikebreakers, and violence, and unions responded with violence of their own, particularly the IW. Labor historian Philip Taft wrote in his 1957 book, The AF of L in the Time of Gompers, in the 5 years between 1906 and 1911, 87 structures erected by non-union labor were dynamited. The campaign of violence was directed by IW Secretary-Treasurer John J.J. McNamara, and union funds were used to finance the campaign. Otis McManigal, a union member, and James B. McNamara, brother of the Secretary-Treasurer, were the leaders in this publicly unknown branch of the union's activity. Arthur Lew Irwin wrote in his 2013 book, Deadly Times, between 1907 and 1911, the United States was hit by the longest period of sustained terrorism in its history. And Otis's newspaper would become a target of this terrorism. Irwin explains. Harrison Gray Otis, owner of the Los Angeles Times' proposal to deunionize San Francisco and Los Angeles, led to its being singled out as a bombing target. The request was made by Eugene Clancy, business agent of the Iron Workers Local in San Francisco, and James Lynch, president of the Typographical Union, who in June 1910 told McNamara, Irwin writes, he wanted the Times silenced. Do that, he argued, in opposition to the unions among Los Angeles businesses would topple. The labor movement in California, he argued, and perhaps the country, hung in the balance. McNamara sent McManigal and his brother to do the job. Irwin notes, until now, every dynamite assignment had been directed at open shop construction jobs. Contractors were sent an implicit message, sign a deal with the unions or face the greater costs of seeing your construction site in shambles. But, Irwin notes, the Los Angeles job wasn't going to be a boiler room in a local foundry, a viaduct under construction, or a lonely construction derrick. This is going to be the Fortress, a building made of brick and granite in downtown Los Angeles. And, Irwin writes, it was going to include the murder of two of the city's preeminent business leaders, Otis and MMA chief Felix Z. Handler. Irwin writes that McNamara never questioned the wisdom of making a sensational strike against the nerve center of capitalist intransigence in Los Angeles. In McNamara's sociopathic mind, he writes, the strike against the Times and the killing of Otis and Z. Handler would inspire workers everywhere to rise up against their capitalist exploiters. The New York Times reported on October 2nd that an explosion early the morning of October 1st in the building of the Los Angeles Times, quickly followed by fire, resulted in the loss of a score of lives and the destruction of the building. Irwin writes that it detonated with such violence that for blocks around, people ran panic-stricken into the streets, believing that an intense earthquake had hit the city. A special correspondent reported to the Dixon, Illinois Evening Telegraph that at 7 minutes past 1 in the morning, an explosion from dynamite, followed instantly by a fire that enveloped the whole structure in flames, completely wrecked the main 3-story building and the adjoining 6-story plant occupied by the Times Mirror Printing and Binding House, Los Angeles Times, killing 21 and badly injuring many more employees of that paper who were at work in the morning edition. The Associated Press reported that the interior of the building was immediately enveloped in flames, which followed the explosion so quickly that those in the building had little chance for escape. The correspondent lamented every one of the men who died, with the exception of one, were married. The Times can buy new presses and rebuild, but the loss of life, that can never be atoned for. The New York Times wrote a massive wreckage and twisted steel girders projecting from heaps of debris, and underneath it all the bodies of a score of dead employees was all that was left at daylight the morning of the Times Mirror newspaper plant at First Street in Broadway. The correspondent adds the damage was not confined to the Times building alone, for a quarter of a block of buildings is in ruins, and about 25 buildings and business houses in the immediate vicinity were more or less damaged. But what about the plan to kill Otis and Z. Handler? The correspondent writes that this was not all that was attempted. A time bomb was discovered under the residence of the secretary of the Merchants and Manufacturers Association, an infernal machine found at General Otis's house, and dynamite at the warehouse and auxiliary plant of the Times. A bomb was discovered at Z. Handler's house the morning of the 2nd. A timing device suggested that the bomb had been set to explode at 1 a.m., the time that the bomb exploded at the Times building. The New York Times reported that the police believe the contrivance was arranged to explode last night, and it is thought that it only failed to do so because the clockwork was wound too tight. The discovery prompted a search of Otis's house, where, with the help of a gardener, a suitcase was found outside a window. An excited chief of police took the case to a nearby park where, the Times reports, its explosion would do comparatively little damage. The device then went off with a crash that threw the entire neighborhood into a panic. The bombers had not just failed to set off their bombs, but their effort was in vain. Otis was on a train that night, returning from a trip to Mexico. The attempt to destroy the auxiliary building had apparently been foiled by a special officer who had seen two men trying to enter the building via a ladder and chased them off. If McNamara thought the attack was going to cause workers to rise up, he was incorrect. The public responded with revulsion. The city offered a $25,000 reward to catch the bombers, while the Times quickly blamed labor. Irwin writes, "The Times building still smoldered, its black and granite front now resembling the ruins of a medieval castle. Like throngs of confused civilian survivors, the crowd continued to pack the streets outside. Many must have wondered, was this scene the first battlefield of a new civil war? If so, what had it accomplished? Why had so many men died? What had the deed triggered, besides grief and mourning?" Moreover, they completely failed to stop the Los Angeles Times, which produced a belated edition that day and continued production. Irwin writes, "And then suddenly the crowd began to hear the cry of newsboys. 'Extra, extra, get your morning paper.' Incredibly, the newspaper these boys were peddling in the smoldering city center of Los Angeles on the first day of October was the Los Angeles Times. They reported, 'A giant shattered wall looks down upon all that is left of the old Times building that played so great a part in the history of this community. But above the wall the old Times eagle stands with pinions outstretched. He has been burned and scorched and flame-licked by murderous fires and shaken by the dynamite of assassins, but he still stands there, a mute note to the world.' Editor Harry Andrews made a statement. 'The Times building was destroyed by dynamite,' he wrote, 'by the enemies of industrial freedom. But the Times itself cannot be destroyed.'" With the instant bad press, labor organizations, including AFL leader Samuel Gompers, deplored the attack and denied that labor could have been involved. Ironically, among those denying the union involvement was J.J. McNamara, who released a statement, "Such an act is anarchy, pure and simple. No sane organization will resort to anything of this kind under any circumstances. I do not believe that labor unions had anything to do with it." Despite the large rewards offered and robust response by the police, and despite apprehending several people in the weeks following, McManigal and McNamara were not immediately caught. But they were in trouble. After the wave of bombing since 1905, the National Erectors Association, a construction industry trade organization, hired a former Secret Service agent turned private detective named William Burns, a detective of such reputation that he was called America's Sherlock Holmes. Writer Louis Adamek wrote in his 1931 book Dynamite, The Story of Class Violence in America, that Burns was in Los Angeles the day after the Times explosion. Mayor Alexander engaged him to get the Times dynamiters. Burns had already suspected James McNamara and Otis McManigal in the previous bombings, and decided to follow them to, Adamek explains, find out to whom he and McManigal were responsible, from whom they were getting money and orders for their work. Finally, he had enough evidence against them, and on April 14, 1911, he arrested James B. McNamara and McManigal in Detroit. Adamek writes that McManigal confessed, giving Burns clues to other evidence. Some of the keys found on him and James B. McNamara opened the locks in farmhouses and other buildings near Indianapolis in which they found dynamite and clocks used for timing bomb explosions. As a result of McManigal's testimony, J.J. McNamara was also arrested in Indianapolis. Labor rallied around the men, raising money for their defense and claiming that the explosion had been caused by a gas leak, not terrorism. For the defense, they hired famed attorney Clarence Darrow and John Harriman, a member of the Socialist Workers' Party and a candidate for mayor of Los Angeles, who seemed that he was on his way to victory, having won the highest percentage of votes in the primary. Both sides are accused and appear to have engaged in various wrongdoing. Reporter Howard Bloom wrote in the LA Times in 2008 that Burns had no qualms about imprisoning suspects in secret locations until a confession was coerced, while Darrow gleefully fled the press unfounded accusations and encouraged fallacious reports dismissing the evidence against the unions as fabricated, and far worse, with breathtaking pragmatism, undermined and disregarded the law. He attempted to bribe witnesses, tried to recruit a spy on the prosecutor's team, and was accused of attempting to bribe jurors. Still, in the end, Bloom writes, Burns' evidence against them, even Darrow was at least forced to concede, was overwhelming. The two pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty.
In 2010, the Los Angeles Times noted that in its time, the Times bombing was the equivalent of the 2001 destruction of the World Trade Center. It was called the crime of the century. It is still the deadliest crime ever to have gone to trial in the state of California. It destroyed the career of Harriman, whose connection to the McNamara's cost him the mayoral campaign and also the fortunes of the Socialist Workers' Party, which previously had been rising in the state of California. It tarnished the reputation of Clarence Darrow, although he was acquitted in 2 separate trials for attempting to bribe jurors. And what's worse, it uncovered the broader bombing campaign that had been going on in the United States for nearly a decade. 58 labor leaders were arrested. 38 were convicted in a series of bombings that had destroyed more than 100 buildings. A nearly forgotten decade of terror in the United States. Convictions that Irwin argues set back the American labor movement for a generation, virtually paralyzing it until the New Deal. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.